Welcome to Lost at 3 a.m. Put your phone down, close your eyes, and let this be the last video you hear tonight. Relax, breathe, and let's begin. Imagine a world where ancient magic meets futuristic technology, where heroes wield legendary swords and powerful spells, and where each journey is more than just an adventure. It's a story that stays with you forever. This is Final Fantasy, a series that has shaped the gaming industry for over 3 decades, creating some of the most unforgettable moments in video game history. But what makes it special isn't just the epic battles, the sprawling worlds, or the beautiful music. It's the feeling of stepping into a new world, one you don't just play, you live in. The feeling of meeting characters who feel like real people, with real struggles and dreams. The feeling of fighting impossible battles, making impossible choices, and watching stories unfold that linger in your mind long after the credits roll. But Final Fantasy didn't start as the legendary franchise we know today. It began as one last attempt, a game that wasn't supposed to be the first in a series, but the last game of a failing company. A final effort, a final chance. And yet this so-called Final Fantasy would go on to become anything but final. Tonight, we're diving into the history, the evolution, and the magic of Final Fantasy, a story of heroes and villains, of world-ending battles and deeply personal journeys, of a fantasy that never truly ends. So close your eyes, drift into the world of summoners, airships, and legendary warriors, and let's begin. Before Final Fantasy became one of the most beloved RPG franchises of all time, it was something much smaller. It was a desperate gamble, a final attempt to save a company on the verge of collapse. The year was 1987, and Square, a struggling Japanese game developer, was on the brink of bankruptcy. They had made games before, but none had been successful enough to keep the company afloat. If their next game failed, Square would shut its doors for good. That's where Hironobu Sakaguchi came in, a young developer with one last idea, a fantasy RPG, inspired by Dragon Quest, but with a deeper story, richer characters, and a world that felt alive. He poured everything into this game, knowing that if it failed, it would be his last project before leaving the gaming industry altogether. And so they called it Final Fantasy. Some say the name came from Square's final hope. Others believe it was Sakaguchi's final project before leaving gaming. Either way, there was something poetic about it. A game meant to be the end that would instead become the beginning of something legendary. When Final Fantasy released on the Nintendo Entertainment System, it didn't just succeed, it saved Square. Players were drawn in by its epic world, its strategic battles, and its unforgettable adventure. Instead of being a last hurrah, it was a revolution, proving that RPGs could be more than just simple quests. They could be cinematic, emotional, and immersive. And so, what was once meant to be Square's final game became the first chapter in one of gaming's greatest legacies. But this was only the start. With each new game, Final Fantasy would push boundaries, defy expectations, and shape the RPG genre forever. And that's when things really started to get interesting. The beauty of Final Fantasy is that it never stays the same. Every game reinvents itself, pushing the limits of technology, storytelling, and gameplay. From its humble beginnings as a simple turn-based RPG to fully cinematic, real-time experiences, the series has never stopped evolving. In 1987, the original Final Fantasy was groundbreaking for its time. The world was vast, the enemies were powerful, and the turn-based combat system introduced depth that was rare in console games. But beyond its mechanics, the game had something special, an epic quest filled with magic, warriors, and an ultimate battle against chaos. Even with its pixelated graphics and limited storytelling, it felt bigger than it was, like the start of something legendary. Then came Final Fantasy IV, and with it, a massive shift. This was no longer just about warriors fighting evil. It was about real characters with struggles, choices, and consequences. Cecil, a dark knight burdened by his past, became one of the first true protagonists in gaming to go through meaningful character development. It was a turning point for RPGs, proving that games could tell deep, emotional stories. Final Fantasy VI expanded on that idea, bringing one of the most impressive narratives ever seen in a 16-bit game. It was no longer about one hero, it was about an entire cast, each with their own arcs, each carrying their own emotional weight. It was a game where the world itself fell apart, where the villain actually won, and where players felt the impact of every decision. Even without modern graphics, the game felt massive, filled with moments that stayed with players long after the credits rolled. Then everything changed. Final Fantasy VII arrived in 1997, and with it came 3D graphics, cinematic cutscenes, and an emotional depth that no one had expected from a video game. Cloud Strife's story wasn't just one players followed, it was one they lived. Midgar felt alive, Sephiroth felt untouchable, and when Aerith died, it felt real. From that moment, Final Fantasy was no longer just an RPG series. It was something bigger, something that shaped the way games were made. Final Fantasy VIII took risks with a more mature, realistic approach, bringing a deeper focus on love, memory, and fate. Final Fantasy IX returned to its medieval fantasy roots, while delivering one of the most heartfelt stories in the franchise. Final Fantasy X introduced fully voiced characters, taking storytelling immersion to a new level. The world of Spira wasn't just a setting, it was a living, breathing place where every culture, every ritual, every song had meaning. Final Fantasy XII shifted everything once again, moving away from traditional turn-based battles and bringing a more fluid, open-ended world. The story was political, the world was massive, and the combat system allowed players to create strategies in ways no previous game had done. It was a step towards something new, an RPG that felt alive, where battles weren't separate encounters, but part of the world itself. Then the series took a massive leap into real-time action. Final Fantasy XV gave players an open world, a dynamic battle system, and a road trip between four brothers in arms that felt unlike anything the series had done before. It was no longer just about questing to save the world. It was about relationships, growth, and the bonds between characters. Final Fantasy XVI went even further, stripping away many of the traditional RPG mechanics and embracing fast-paced cinematic battles that felt like something out of an action movie. It was a return to dark fantasy, a world filled with war, gods, and fate, bringing a more mature tone to the franchise. Every entry brings something new, something fresh, something unexpected. But no matter how much Final Fantasy evolves, one thing remains the same: its heart. Because at its core, Final Fantasy isn't just about graphics, combat systems, or technological innovation. It's about stories that stay with you. It's about characters that feel real, even when they wield swords larger than their bodies, or cast magic that bends reality. It's about worlds that feel like home, places that you leave behind, only to find yourself thinking about them years later. And that's why, after more than 3 decades, Final Fantasy is still a legend in the making. Final Fantasy isn't just about grand adventures or mythical worlds. It's about the people in them. The warriors, the rebels, the outcasts, the leaders. The ones who fight not because they want to, but because they have to. Every game in the series introduces a new cast of characters, and yet, no matter how different they are, they all have something in common: growth, struggle, and the journey to become something more than they were when they started. Cloud Strife is one of the most recognizable protagonists in gaming history. A soldier with a cold exterior, carrying a blade almost as big as he is, Cloud starts his journey in Final Fantasy VII as an arrogant mercenary with no real purpose. But as the story unfolds, his past begins to unravel. The things he believed about himself weren't real. His memories weren't his own. His pain, his doubts, his guilt, they become part of his battle just as much as his fight against Sephiroth. Cloud's journey isn't just about saving the world, it's about figuring out who he really is. Then there's Squall Leonhardt, the distant, brooding hero of Final Fantasy VIII. If Cloud struggles with identity, Squall struggles with connection. He's cold, closed off, convinced that relying on others is a weakness. But as he's forced into leadership, as he faces war, loss, and love, he changes. His story is about breaking down walls, about letting people in, about realizing that strength isn't just about fighting alone, it's about fighting for others. Tidus from Final Fantasy X is different. He isn't a warrior when his journey begins. He's a celebrity athlete, cocky, full of life, completely out of his element when he's thrown into a world he doesn't understand. But as he travels through Spira, as he learns the truth about sin, about the cycle of death and sacrifice, he realizes that he's more than just a visitor in this story. He's part of it. His fate is tied to it. And by the time he reaches the end of his journey, he has to make a choice that no one should ever have to make. And then there's Zidane, the thief with a heart of gold in Final Fantasy IX. Unlike Cloud or Squall, Zidane isn't burdened by a tragic past, at least not at first. He's charming, carefree, always ready with a joke. But as the story unfolds, he's forced to face a truth that shatters everything he thought he knew about himself. His journey is about identity, about self-worth, about finding a reason to exist when everything else is taken away. The heroes of Final Fantasy aren't just warriors. They aren't just chosen ones, or legendary heroes destined to save the world. They're people. They're broken. They're flawed. They make mistakes. They doubt themselves. And that's what makes them feel real. Whether it's Lightning, burdened by the responsibility of saving her sister in Final Fantasy VIII, or Noctis, a prince weighed down by destiny in Final Fantasy XV. Every protagonist in the series brings something new, something human. These aren't just characters in a game, they're reflections of ourselves, of the things we struggle with, the things we fight for, the things we lose, and the things we find again. That's why Final Fantasy's characters don't just exist inside their worlds. They exist in the hearts of the players who experience their journeys. Long after the game is over, their stories stay with us. Because in the end, their battles are more than just epic fights against impossible odds. They're stories of growth, of change, of discovering who you really are. And that is what makes them legendary. A hero is only as strong as the enemy they face. And Final Fantasy has given us some of the most unforgettable villains in gaming history. These aren't just final bosses or obstacles to overcome. They are forces of destruction, chaos, and tragedy, each with their own beliefs, motivations, and moments of shocking cruelty. Some seek godhood, some seek vengeance, and some simply want to watch the world burn. Sephiroth is the name that comes to mind first. He isn't just a villain, he's an icon. The long silver hair, the cold green eyes, the impossibly long sword. His presence alone is enough to make even the strongest heroes question whether they can actually stop him. But Sephiroth wasn't always a monster. He was a hero once, a warrior that others admired, until he learned the truth. He wasn't just a soldier, he wasn't even human. He was an experiment, a creation, and when that realization shattered his mind, he turned against everything. The moment he stepped into the flames of Nibelheim, everything changed. Then there's Kefka from Final Fantasy VI, where Sephiroth is cold and calculated. Kefka is something else entirely. Pure, unfiltered madness. He starts as a cruel, power-hungry general, but what makes him truly terrifying is that he wins. He doesn't just talk about destruction, he causes it. He becomes a god, destroys half the world, and laughs as he does it. Where most villains believe they are justified in their actions, Kefka believes in nothing. No purpose, no redemption, just chaos for the sake of chaos. Some villains aren't monsters, they're tragic figures. Arden Izunia from Final Fantasy XV is one of the most complex antagonists in the series. He wasn't always the enemy. Once, he was a chosen savior, a healer, a protector of his people, but he was betrayed, cast aside, left to rot in darkness for centuries. By the time we meet him, he is something else entirely. He isn't just seeking revenge. He is the embodiment of vengeance itself. And unlike other villains, Ardian doesn't just want to win. He wants to make sure his enemies suffer the way he suffered. There's Ultimecia, a sorceress so powerful that she doesn't just control time. She wants to compress it, to rewrite reality itself. There's Sin, an unstoppable force of destruction in Final Fantasy X, representing an endless cycle of suffering that has no true beginning and no true end. There's Seymour, who hides behind false kindness, smiling as he speaks of death as if it were a gift, manipulating others into believing that his way is the only way. But what makes Final Fantasy villains so memorable isn't just their power, it's the way they challenge the heroes. It's the way they force them to question themselves, to grow, to change. They aren't just enemies, they are symbols. They are reminders that the greatest battles aren't always fought with swords or magic, but with the choices we make, with the pain we endure, and with the will to keep going even when all seems lost. Final Fantasy doesn't just give us villains, it gives us forces of nature, of destiny, of tragedy. And that is why, long after the final battle is over, long after the credits roll, their names are still whispered. Because in the world of Final Fantasy, darkness isn't just something to be defeated, it's something that must be faced, understood, and ultimately overcome. Final Fantasy isn't just a game, it's an experience. And nothing brings that experience to life more than its music. The soaring orchestral themes, the haunting melodies, the battle anthems that make every encounter feel like the fight of a lifetime. From the first notes of the prelude to the final crescendo of an emotional ending theme, the music of Final Fantasy isn't just background noise, it's storytelling in its purest form. At the heart of it all is Nobuo Uematsu, the composer who shaped the sound of the series. His music isn't just memorable, it's iconic. It doesn't just accompany the game, it defines it. His melodies don't fade into the background. They stay with you, long after the adventure is over. Few pieces in gaming are as instantly recognizable as One-Winged Angel from Final Fantasy VII. The first time you hear that chilling choir, the Latin chanting, the chaotic orchestration, you know you're standing in front of something unstoppable. It's not just Sephiroth's theme, it's his presence in musical form. The build-up, the rising intensity, the sudden moments of silence before the next wave of sound crashes down. It all mirrors the tension of the final battle, making it one of the most unforgettable pieces in gaming history. But Final Fantasy isn't just about epic battle themes, it's about emotion, and few pieces capture that emotion better than Tazanakand from Final Fantasy X. There's no grand orchestra, no overpowering instruments, just a simple, melancholic piano melody that speaks louder than words ever could. It's a song that tells a story before a single word is spoken, a song that carries the weight of an entire journey, of loss, of fate, of the things we cannot change. Then there's Aerith's theme, a melody filled with warmth, hope and light, until the moment it becomes a song of grief. It's the kind of music that doesn't just accompany a moment, it is the moment, the sound of heartbreak, of realization, of something precious slipping away forever, and that's what makes it so powerful. But not every song in Final Fantasy is about sadness. There's battle on the big bridge, an adrenaline-fueled rush that turns every fight against Gilgamesh into a chaotic spectacle. There's the Chocobo theme, a fun, light-hearted tune that somehow finds a new twist in almost every game. And of course, there's the victory fanfare, that short, triumphant theme that signals the end of a battle, the moment of relief after a hard-fought fight. It's a small moment, but one that never gets old. And beyond the games, the music of Final Fantasy has taken on a life of its own. The Distant Worlds concerts bring the music to live audiences across the globe. performed by full orchestras, showing that this isn't just video game music. It's something more. It's timeless. It's powerful. It's something that stays with you, whether you're hearing it for the first time or the 100th. Final Fantasy's music isn't just a soundtrack, it's the heart and soul of the series. It makes you feel the weight of every decision, the joy of every triumph, the sorrow of every loss. It doesn't just support the story, it is the story, told through melody instead of words. And that's why, even after decades, even after so many games, the music of Final Fantasy still has the power to transport you back to that moment, that battle, that victory, that loss. Because some songs never leave you, Final Fantasy has always been about more than just the story. At its heart, it's a game about battles, epic, larger-than-life encounters, where magic, strategy, and skill all come together. But what makes Final Fantasy combat truly special is the way it evolves, shifting from game to game, never staying the same. At the core of every battle are summons, espers, aeons, eidolons, and primals, legendary beings that can turn the tide of any fight. From the moment you first call forth Ifrit, watching him rise from flames, or summon Shiva, who freezes the battlefield with a wave of her hand, you realize these aren't just powerful spells. They are gods, warriors, forces of nature. They don't just attack, they arrive in grand cinematic displays, bringing destruction and spectacle unlike anything else. Bahamut, the king of dragons, unleashes Mega Flare, obliterating everything in his path. Odin appears for just a second, his sword slicing through enemies before they even realize what's happened. Roma, covered in lightning, raises his staff, calling down judgment from the sky. Every summon has its own legend, its own presence, its own way of making you feel like you're wielding something far beyond mortal power. But summons are just one piece of the combat puzzle. Final Fantasy has always been about magic, and every game reinvents how spells work. Some, like Final Fantasy VII, tie magic to materia, letting you mix and match abilities like building blocks. Others, like Final Fantasy VIII, treat magic as a resource that must be drawn from enemies and stored for later. Then there's the license board of Final Fantasy XII, the sphere grid of Final Fantasy X, each one giving players a new way to shape their characters and make every party unique. And then there's the battles themselves. In the early days, combat was simple, turn-based strategy, waiting for your moment to strike, choosing between attack, magic, and item. But as the series grew, the battles became faster, more dynamic. The active time battle system made every choice feel urgent, forcing players to think on their feet. Final Fantasy XIII introduced the paradigm shift system, letting you swap strategies mid-battle. Final Fantasy XV moved into real-time action, blending magic and swordplay into fluid cinematic fights. And now, Final Fantasy XVI has taken combat to the next level, feeling more like a high-speed action game than a traditional RPG. No two games in the series play the same. Some are strategic and methodical, forcing you to plan out every move. Others are fast and relentless, testing your reflexes as much as your strategy. But no matter how much Final Fantasy's combat changes, one thing stays the same: the feeling. The feeling of watching a summon arrive in a blaze of fire and lightning. The feeling of unleashing a limit break at the last second to turn the battle in your favor. The feeling of standing on the edge of defeat, only to land the final blow just in time. Final Fantasy's combat isn't just about mechanics. It's about power, tension, strategy, and spectacle. It's about making every battle feel like a moment, a challenge, a legend in the making. Final Fantasy isn't just a game series, it's a phenomenon. It didn't just change RPGs, it changed how stories are told in video games. It redefined what players could expect from a fantasy world, what they could feel from a digital character, and what it meant to be part of something bigger than just gameplay. When Final Fantasy VII was released in 1997, it wasn't just another RPG, it was a cultural moment. It introduced millions of players to the genre, proving that video games could tell cinematic, emotional stories on par with movies. Before Final Fantasy VII, games had narratives, but they weren't told with sprawling 3D environments, full-motion cutscenes, and characters that felt deeply human. It was the first time many players realized that a game could make them feel something beyond excitement. It could make them care. But the impact of Final Fantasy goes beyond just one game. The series has shaped the way RPGs are made, inspiring countless franchises like Kingdom Hearts, Persona, and even Western RPGs like Mass Effect. It brought ideas that were once niche: turn-based combat, character-driven storytelling, and deep world-building into the mainstream. It wasn't just about mechanics, though. Final Fantasy set the standard for music in video games. Before Nobuo Uematsu, game soundtracks were often simple, looping melodies, but Final Fantasy brought full orchestral scores, sweeping themes, and emotionally charged compositions that could rival any Hollywood film. Today, the music of Final Fantasy is performed in live symphony concerts around the world, proving that these melodies have become more than just background noise. They are part of gaming history. Final Fantasy also broke cultural barriers. For years, Japanese RPGs were a niche genre outside of Japan, but Final Fantasy helped bridge the gap. It introduced Western audiences to the unique storytelling style of Japanese games, blending fantasy and sci-fi, deep emotion with epic battles. It showed that players didn't just want action, they wanted story, characters, world building, and the series has continued to evolve with the times, shifting its gameplay styles, its combat systems, and even the way it tells its stories, making sure it stays relevant for each new generation. But perhaps the most important impact of Final Fantasy is the way it brings people together, whether it's through online games like Final Fantasy XIV, where entire communities form lasting friendships, or through conventions and concerts where fans celebrate their favorite moments. Final Fantasy isn't just a series people play, it's a world they become part of. It's hard to measure the true cultural impact of Final Fantasy because, in many ways, it's everywhere. It's in the way games tell stories now. It's in the music that plays in concert halls. It's in the conversations between players who grew up with these characters, who still remember the first time they stepped into Midgar, or the first time they watched the world fall apart in Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy didn't just change gaming, it changed the way we see games. It proved that they could be art, storytelling, music, emotion, all wrapped into one unforgettable experience. Final Fantasy has never been a series that stays in the past. While it honors its legacy, it has always been about pushing forward, evolving, and redefining what an RPG can be. Even after decades, it's still changing, still surprising players, still proving that a fantasy is never truly final. One of the biggest reasons Final Fantasy remains relevant today is Final Fantasy XIV. What started as a failed MMORPG was completely reborn with A Realm Reborn, turning it into one of the most successful and beloved online games of all time. Unlike previous Final Fantasy games, this wasn't just a story you played through once. It was a living, breathing world that kept expanding. Entire communities formed within it. Players forged friendships that lasted beyond the game, and its expansions, like Heavensward, Shadowbringers, and Endwalker, delivered some of the best storytelling the series has ever seen. But Final Fantasy isn't just an online experience. When Final Fantasy XV was released, it took the series into open-world gameplay, blending real-time combat with a road trip-style journey unlike anything the franchise had done before. It wasn't a traditional RPG, it was something new, something different. And while it divided fans, it proved one thing: Final Fantasy is never afraid to take risks. Then came Final Fantasy VII Remake. More than just a nostalgia trip, it reimagined one of the most iconic games in history, expanding its story, deepening its characters, and bringing Midgar to life in ways that no one could have imagined back in 1997. It wasn't just about replaying an old favourite, it was about experiencing it in a completely new way, one that made it feel fresh, even for those who knew the story by heart. Now, Final Fantasy XVI has taken the series into new territory once again. It moves further away from traditional RPG mechanics, embracing real-time action combat, dark fantasy themes, and a more mature political storyline. It's fast, brutal, and cinematic, with a world that feels more grounded, yet still full of the magic and wonder that makes Final Fantasy what it is. Even after all these years, Final Fantasy is still evolving. It's still finding new ways to tell stories, new ways to immerse players, new ways to redefine itself. Some fans miss the turn-based combat, the classic RPG mechanics, the old-school feel of the earlier games. Others embrace the modern, action-packed direction. But no matter which era of Final Fantasy you love most, one thing is certain. This franchise isn't going anywhere. It's still growing, still changing, still surprising us. And as long as people are willing to go on one more adventure, there will always be another Final Fantasy waiting for them. Final Fantasy is more than just a series of games. It's a legacy, a story that has been told and retold in 1,000 different ways, across decades, across generations. It's not just about battles or summons or legendary swords. It's about the emotions it leaves behind. For some, Final Fantasy is the first RPG they ever played, the game that introduced them to a world beyond platformers and action titles. For others, it's a story that helped them through difficult times, a journey they could escape into when reality felt too overwhelming. And for many, it's something shared, between friends who grew up playing together, between siblings who passed the controller back and forth, between parents and children discovering the magic of these worlds side by side. Every player has their own Final Fantasy. Maybe it's the first time they set foot in Midgar, watching the city stretch out before them. Maybe it's the moment they realized that the world of Spira was built on an endless cycle of sacrifice. Maybe it's a melody, a battle, a line of dialogue that still lingers in their mind long after the game is over. Final Fantasy has changed gaming. It has changed storytelling. And in some small way, it has changed the people who play it. Because the best stories do that. They stay with you. They shape you. They remind you that no matter how dark things get, there is always a journey ahead, always a new path to walk, always one more battle to fight. That's why, after all these years, Final Fantasy still matters. Because no fantasy is ever truly final. There is always another story waiting to be told. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest adventure is still ahead. Thank you for spending your night with Lost at 3 AM. Sweet dreams, and we'll see you next time.